Welcome to ConstitutionWorld, a forum featuring exciting and impactful thinkers and doers who work with constitutions, who study constitutions, and who design constitutions. My guest today is David Landau, the Mason Ladd Professor of Law at Florida State University. And together we discuss Abusive Constitutionalism, the title of his pioneering paper published 10 years ago in 2013. My name is Richard Albert, and welcome to Constitution World. David Landau, my friend, it's good to see you. It has been quite a decade for you. The year 2023 marks the 10th anniversary of your field-defining paper, Abusive Constitutionalism. I remember actually when I first saw your paper, I first read it, we were together in Paris at the Collège de France. And you showed me your paper then, and you discussed it at the seminar that we were there for. And since then, it's really been remarkable to see just how much your paper has influenced scholars all around the world, how it has prompted new papers, new books, and how perhaps most importantly of all, David, how it sounded the alarm on this troubling phenomenon that you've identified. And so as we begin our conversation, I wonder if you might just take a moment to reflect back on the last decade, the decade of David. How does it feel to have created this new subfield in constitutional studies?
Yeah, interesting. No, thanks so much for inviting me and for giving me a chance to talk about the paper. I can't believe it's been 10 years, honestly. It doesn't feel that long, it's neat in the sense that both neat and a little bit weird, I guess I would say, right? Neat in the sense that it's nice to see a paper open up a line of work, right, and research that I think is kind of flexible and can be applied to different situations all around the world. I think that's part of why the pieces caught on. It's the basic idea is one that is applicable to a lot of different constitutional systems around the world, right? And so, you've seen people pick up abusive constitutionalism in Brazil, for example, right? Or, abusive constitutionalism in Hungary, those kinds of things. And then some cases I never would have thought of and know very little about, right? Where people are trying to apply the basic framework to those situations. I think the other thing is it tapped into a lot of work that a few of us were doing at the time, and where I think you, my friend, are probably the most prominent exponent of work on constitutional change, right? And so that became a key subfield of comparative constitutional law. And I think, sometimes, some ways, what I was picking up on is just the sort of dark side of constitutional change, right? The way that it can be used to undermine and attack democracy. And so it's been good to see that people are, I guess, attuned to that problem, right, and to constitutional change more broadly.
The dark side of constitution making and constitutional change. You've actually written a number of papers on the dark side, the Janus space-like nature of constitution making. I think of your paper, Constitution Making Gone Wrong, example, which predated abusive constitutionalism. So you've been oriented in this direction for some time, since the very beginning, perhaps, of your research into constitutionalism.
Yeah, I've always had a kind of I guess, an almost sort of Burkean fear about constitutional change in a way, right? At some level, a kind of classic conservatism in that sense, right? I think, not necessarily in any kind of direct political sense, but in a broader sense of like awareness of risks of change, right? And I think particularly, I think I think I'm committed to those ideas, right? That we want to find ways to channel constitutional change so that it serves the functions it should serve, but it doesn't, undermine the democratic order or the basic order of a society, or do things like, radically increase polarization, right, within the society. And I think, like an interesting example to me of that maybe worldview in a way is, Chile over the past 4 years, right, has been, I think, a really interesting, unfortunately, very difficult period in which you initiate a constitution making process with so much promise, right? And that promise is still there, but there's also, I do think the very long, complex Chilean constitution making episode has highlighted some of the risks that come along with rewriting your constitution, particularly when it comes to dimensions like polarization. The responses to those problems aren't obvious. I mean, one of the things when I wrote Abusive Constitutionalism that really stuck out to me, it was sort of a depressing paper to write because I felt like I'd identified a problem pretty well. But when I got to the solutions part of the paper, it was kind of like, well, this isn't really going to work. This isn't really going to work, right? There are a bunch of things I kind of go through where I just suggest it's not clear to me that you can actually fix the problem that easily. And I think that's still where I'm at, right? I think there's, it's a very difficult set of risks to tackle ultimately.
I want to come back to the solutions you proposed in 2013, 10 years ago today, in just a little bit. But first, I want to make some progress just to get everyone to speed. What is abusive constitutionalism? What's this phenomenon that really you were able to encapsulate in this paper in a way that people recognized it right away?
Yeah, right. So the original project basically described it as like using tools of constitutional change. And the initial paper, really, what I was talking about is formal tools, right? Amendment and replacement of the Constitution, changing the text or replacing the text in a way that undermines kind of a relatively minimal conception of democracy, right? Kind of what Roz Dixon and I have called in subsequent work, sort of the democratic minimum core. And that's the original idea, right? And I think the power maybe of that idea comes from the fact that it seems to be pretty common, unfortunately. And I was writing at a time when this was something people were starting to pay attention to. It was going on, it seems like, across a bunch of different countries. And it's not hard to do because you can follow the formal rules for whatever they're worth, but still potentially do things that, weaken the opposition, entrench incumbents, right? Weaken individual rights. There are lots of ways in which you can kind of pattern or work on constitutional change that really undermine the other side, right? Really undermine the opposition. And subsequently, it's been broadened. I mean, I think the key or the core is still, to me, the term abusive should really be reserved for attacks on this relatively minimalist conception of democracy, right? That there's some temptation to apply abuse, I think, more broadly than it ought to be, right? Anything change that I don't like or change that's problematic for other reasons. Sometimes I think that slippage a little bit, right? But to me, like the original conception has value precisely because it's tied to a kind of yardstick that I hope there's still pretty broad agreement, right? Which is a kind of minimalist idea of democracy. But I think what we've seen, and I give a lot of credit to my very frequent co-author and good friend Roz Dixon, right, on this, is the concept can be broadened beyond formal change, right? So some of the follow-up work we did, for example, looking at courts as a pretty, unfortunately, sometimes potent agent of abusive constitutional change. Courts getting rid of their own constitution's term limits, for example, through interpretations or through doctrine, kind of exotic use of constitutional doctrine in a way that actually worsens the democratic system and shows, sometimes courts attack the democratic order. They don't just protect it, right, as the literature suggests. And so kind of broadened outward as to, I think, what I've seen, what Roz has really helped to see is how many different forms of change can be used in this way.
So we've gone from the formal to the
Mhm.
informal, really,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
occupying the entire field. You mentioned slippage, the
Mm.
idea that the current understanding of abusive constitutionalism has really shifted away from your original conception. And this is something that I've seen happen to other really foundational theories in the field of constitutional studies. So think, for example, of constitutional moments, right?
Yeah.
Everything is a constitutional moment, but that is not what Professor Bruce Ackerman really had in mind when he defined the idea of a constitutional moment. And the same thing has happened with abusive constitutionalism. I see you nodding. You want to say more about that?
Well, yeah, no, I think it's, in a way it's inevitable. I mean, you come up with your idea and then they're there. And they get used, right? And they get used in all kinds of different ways. Some of them I would argue more careful than others. Some of them sort of try to stretch the concept. I think it's just something that happens, and I see it all across the social sciences, right? And definitely throughout our field. It's really interesting as a phenomenon. And then, like I said, what's weird about this piece in a way is, I'll people will send me papers, or I'll just come across papers from all over the place, all kinds of jurisdictions. It's neat. I know you have very similar experiences with your ideas on constitutional change, right? Where the ideas migrate, and that's one of the really interesting things about our field. I think, in particular, how global it is. But you can't control directly how the ideas get used, right, and cited. And I think the slippage I said in my case, the thing that I've most noticed with the abuse idea is it broadens out from like the original understanding of an attack on kind of a minimalist electoral conception of democracy. Even that's not so simple. I mean, as we know, fair electoral democracy is complex, right, as a concept, but it gets broadened out to other things like amendments that that undermine things like social rights, for as an example, where that's something like I don't like that amendment, right, in terms of my own kind of political background, but I guess what I would want to say is there's a contestability to that stuff where what you don't want to do is get to the point where you're labeling amendments that reflect contestation about what constitutionalism ought to be and calling that abuse. I think that's dangerous, right? And actually kind of boomerangs around and in a way undermines the idea of abusive constitutionalism itself. So I think that the kind of care with which the concept is used, which is hard, but I think it's important. And as I periodically, like I or Roz and I kind of in co-authored stuff, will go back and like reiterate, like, this is the yardstick, right? As I understand it, as we understand it. And I think that's worth doing periodically. But at the same time, I think the slippage is inevitable. I mean, I think it just happens as ideas migrate and travel. And I think maybe it's particularly inevitable in a global field like ours, where stuff gets picked up, it gets translated, right? It gets used in new languages and new contexts.
So is there a clear case of abusive constitutionalism that you want to just identify as a paradigmatic case?
Yeah.
It's clearly an attack on what you regard to be the core democratic minimum core of constitutionalism. Let's hear from you. What's this paradigmatic case?
Yeah, no, it's a harder question than one would like, right? Because it can be a tricky concept. But I go back to some of the initial work that I did, right? And I think I still tend to gravitate to the Venezuelan case as kind of a classic example of the phenomenon over, unfortunately, a long period of time, right? You take a constitutional order that was clearly troubled, but fundamentally had democratic features, and you replace it, Hugo Chavez replaces it in 1999 with a constitution that consolidates his power and kind of undermines and sort of marginalizes the opposition, right? So the 1999 constitution making process in Venezuela kind of starts it, and then you have subsequent episodes that kind of continue it. It's interesting and unfortunate to see the deepening of it over time. I mean, there's the referendum in 2009 where Chavez gets rid of presidential term limits, right? And so then, now you have a president that can stay in office forever, essentially. And then even subsequent to that, you have the Supreme Court of Venezuela engaged in what I think is clearly abusive judicial review, right? Where the opposition wins control of the legislature around the middle of the last decade. And the response of the Supreme Court to that is basically to take away all the powers of the opposition controlled legislature using legal concepts, but like twisting them in ways that bear, I would argue, no resemblance to the rule of law, right? They literally make it impossible for the legislature to legislate, which is the basic function, right, of a legislature. And so I think what is interesting about the Venezuelan case is how many different tools you see used for the same end over a long period of time, and it's interesting. It's disheartening in that I think it's probably to me the leading case study of like how little adherence to the formal rules or the formal law can mean, right? There are cases where it's like if you think, well, law itself will protect democracy in a kind of formal sense, it doesn't often, right? And I think that's a good example of that phenomenon and that problem. And it's one of the cases that I look at and I think does convince me again, like this is a very, very difficult problem to solve.
And even the solutions that you closed your paper with 10 years ago, if you try to apply those solutions to the Venezuelan case, you're left with kind of your palms up, your arms up, like that's not going to solve the problem, right?
Yeah.
Unamendable rules. What would that have done?
Right.
Escalating or tiered amendment procedures. What would that have done?
Right.
An international constitutional court. Another solution that you raised for discussion. Would that have worked? Could that work today? No. So where are we left then, David? You've had 10 years now to think about the problem, to see it manifest around the world in jurisdictions that are known to you and perhaps less familiar to you. Are you more clear now in thinking about what some possible solutions might be?
No, I mean, not really. I wish, I think maybe you could say slow progress, but I think if anything, what I've developed an appreciation for more clearly is how hard it is to resolve the problem, right? Rather than finding particular solutions. And I think, the reason for that ultimately is you think about the tools that you trust, and in some ways there's kind of two. One is constitutional design, right? And the other is international law, the international level. And if anything, I think we've learned more about the limitations of both of those, if that makes sense. I mean, I think at the constitutional design level, it's not impossible. I'm committed to a project that, thinks through the use of design to kind of fortify democracy, but it's quite difficult because these attacks and attempts run in very different forms, right? And they also often have a double-edged sword quality to them, where they can benefit you or harm you. And it's the classic example again is a court, right? You think, well, a strong court that'll protect the democratic order. Sometimes, in the way that authors like Sam Issacharoff, for example, have pointed out, right? Sometimes, but in other cases, I think the opposite in a sense, right? The courts can become a tool to dismantle democracy. So in some contexts, the stronger the court, the more tools you're giving them to attack the democratic order. That said, I think there are things you can do. It's just hard to in a way, it can be tricky to develop a general theory. And I think you want to be humble about the suggestions, right, at the level of constitutional design. I mean, I do think things, and Roz and I have been thinking about this to some degree, is, you know, splitting authority, appointment authority, and things like that over different actors, decentralizing power. Those things have costs, actually, but in certain contexts where there's a real risk of kind of democratic takeover, you know, they're probably worth doing, right? And so there are ways to think about design that, for example, does things like make capture of courts more difficult, you know, and it's worth theorizing about, I think, and working on those kinds of things. And then I think that, you know, the practice of, you know, escalating constitutional amendment rules, right, as you've written about, right, or eternity clauses, right, which is, you know, as Yaniv Rosnai, for example, has written about, those things can have value, but I think we have a long way to go in figuring out how to deploy those technologies. What I mean is, like, what do you put on the higher tiers, for example? And, you know, as you've written, it seems like in existing constitutions, a big purpose of those is symbolic. You know, it's to reflect a set of values that are fundamental. You think about the German dignity clause, for example, and that's useful. But the kind of technology that, you know, that I was trying to spark a discussion about with the paper, like, practically, how do you stop it? It's different, I think, right? Like, you'd want to protect different things, and I still think we have a ways to go in figuring out what, if anything, would work in a design and kind of practical situations when the democracy is under attack.
And so now, David, we're 10 years after the publication of, really, I think, is the most important paper of the past decade, because of everything that it's spurred and prompted and initiated, the kinds of conversations and reflection that it's initiated. So you deserve congratulations, but I think also thanks on behalf of the field of constitutional studies, because you've opened up this really interesting set of research streams for us all. So that was then. 10 years later, what's next?
Yeah. No, I mean, you know, thanks so much for those kind words and remarks. I really appreciate them. I never had any idea when I wrote the paper that it would have the impact it did. You know, I think it's often true when you're writing something, you don't know, you know, and I remember having the thought repeatedly writing it, like, this is obvious. Everybody knows this. It's obvious, you know, that kind of reaction. One lesson maybe for people writing is, like, those often end up being the best papers I found, right? The ones that do seem like kind of you're crystallizing something that's there, you know, and kind of clarifying it. There can be real value, I think, to that. But no, I appreciate that. In terms of now, you know, my recent work has turned a few different directions. One is, despite the cautions I just mentioned, ideas about constitutional design and sort of resilience in the face of anti-democratic attacks. That's a project, and will, I think, be a book that Roz and I are working on, actually. That's sort of a follow-up on our abusive constitutional borrowing book from a few years ago, and it's a little bit more oriented, actually, at the solutions piece of the problem. The other big line that you know, I've been working on for a while now is the U.S. So I kind of started as a comparativist who was actually just, like, not that interested in studying the U.S. I was more interested in, like, Ecuador probably than I was in the U.S. But I've changed in that regard, I think, in part because I started to see a few years after the publication of that article the value of, or the applicability of, some of the problems, right, the I was working on abroad to the U.S. And so I think there's an urgent need to think about how you strengthen democracy in the United States, right? And you know, it's worth noting, as others like Tom Ginsburg and Aziz Huq have done, that the U.S. Constitution is not maybe particularly robust against anti-democratic threats, at least formally, right? There may be some other strengths that are kind of more informal in nature. So there is a project about, what would or should be done there. And for example, the moment I'm thinking a bit about independent accountability institutions that aren't courts, and how we could think about those and what they might do within the U.S. constitutional order, because we are kind of an outlier, not really having many of those institutions. They're not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, which isn't surprising. Legislatively, at times there have been kind of echoes of them, but I think there's room for a project about getting beyond the court, which often both in the U.S. and the rest of the world actually has a pretty disappointing record when it comes to strengthening democracy, and thinking about what you could do with respect to other institutions.
So kind of like the fourth branch type institutions that people are writing increasingly more about, namely Mark Tushnet's recent book about that.
Yeah.
Can we learn anything about other federal countries in relation to how to strengthen the U.S. constitutional order?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think, it's another area where I think there's room for more work, and kind of, more work than has been done so far. I did with a couple of my co-authors, the Wiseman, Sam and Hannah Wiseman, do a little bit of work on thinking about federalism and democracy in the U.S. And in some ways, I actually think, U.S. style federalism offers some advantages that are attenuated in some of the other federal systems I know about around the world, right? And that, like, we decentralize certain functions so much. Think about how we run elections, for example, right? Elections incredibly decentralized in the U.S., more so than at least anywhere I know of in the world, right? And really down to the county level. And that, I think we have we're running a kind of experiment right now about how effective that is as protection for U.S. democracy. And it does have an advantage. If you're in a country with a very strong apex level independent electoral commission, if that commission is captured, the game's kind of over, right? Like, at that point, it's the commission can become a pretty effective institution to kind of rig the elections, basically. Whereas the U.S., there isn't such an institution really to capture, right? I mean, you got to go down to the local level. What's happened since the 2020 election is there has been a concerted attempt, for example, by Trump allies, to kind of get and capture different local level institutions, and they're decentralized, but they're not that insulated in a way, right? Like, it's kind of easy to access them. It's just there's a lot of them scattered all over. And so I think the decentralization was actually part of the reason why the U.S. democracy kind of survived the 2020 test. But the 2024 test is forthcoming. And I'm a little bit, obviously more concerned about how resilient the democratic system will prove at that point.
Interesting. You're focusing on the democratic system as opposed to the U.S. Constitution. Of course, they're related, but my question here is the U.S. Constitution too old? Your area of expertise is, of course, the world, but one of the peculiarly important areas of expertise that you've really given us all with your research is a window into Latin America. And there, of course, the constitutions don't endure for many generations. And so is there anything that could be learned from them about the frequent replacement of constitutions? Is this something that the U.S. could benefit from? Or is there something, maybe a redeeming virtue of the stability that comes with having a constitution that is now 236 years old, since it was written in 1787?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think in general, there has been value to the stability of the U.S. constitutional text, right? The fact that it is something that hasn't been replaced too frequently is valuable. But in the sense, this it really goes back to that that great book by uh, Elkins, Ginsburg, and Melton, right? The one on constitutional endurance is what I think of, where one of the things they say in that book is if it's gotta bend so it doesn't break in a way, right? And what I worry about with the U.S. constitutional order, you compare it to Latin America, where not only are constitutions replaced fairly frequently, but they're pretty flexible typically as well, right? So they get there's places like Brazil and Mexico that got to get amended enormous amounts. The amendment rate varies obviously country to country. And the case I can think of sometimes, my original research line was really Colombia, a country I still have a deep interest in. And I do think a lot of Colombia in the 80s and 1991 is a kind of analog for this moment in the US, maybe a weird one to a lot of people, right? But the idea is, Colombia at that point, there was the amendment, the change mechanisms for various reasons were kind of frozen. There was, the ability to actually change the Constitution kind of froze up. And so the sense that people had was the Constitution isn't kind of meeting the moment anymore. It's not, we got this deep crisis and the Constitution is not allowing us to kind of catch up. So that's where the movement to replace the 1886 Constitution, which also at that point was an old Constitution, with the 1991 one came from. And eventually it came to fruition through the theory of constituent power, right? And you end up with a constituent assembly that worked. The U.S., the problem to me is, and again, I have a diagnosis but no solution, unfortunately, is, look, so constitutional replacement is something that can be done. You never hear the discussion in the U.S., or not never, but very rarely, right? It's a very fringe idea. And I don't know if it should be a fringe idea, right? If you look around the world, as we know, constitutional replacements are relatively frequent, but it's also dangerous. I mean, I do think that my experience is observing the Chilean experience over the past few years is just deepened my sense that you often want to avoid replacing your constitution if possible, because it can be a very destabilizing moment. The normal rules of politics kind of fade, and it really depends on who grabs space in that power vacuum. So they can be difficult moments for democratic systems. But if you don't, so if replacement's kind of a bad idea normatively, and one that's very unlikely, then you think, okay, if it's not going to break, it's got to bend, And the thing is, the U.S. Constitution it seems to bend less than it used to. Both, I think, formally and to some degree, and even informally. And so, what's the solution to that? I mean, I think, you read some of the history, and there were moments where the door to Article 5, the amendment route, was more open. The progressive era, for example, always difficult but more open. Now it just seems frozen. So frozen with no exit is not a good place. Not a good place to be.
So we've talked about abusive constitutionalism, all of the ways that constitutional orders are being attacked from within, using the democratic procedures of change. That's not a happy portrait. We've talked about the U.S. Constitution and the risk that it might collapse from within as well. It can't break, it can't bend. So what do? Is there a happy ending here, David, that we can close our conversation on? As you look around the world, are there bright spots that to you lead you to believe that this project of constitutionalism in which we're all engaged is worth fighting for, and that some people are doing it correctly according to you and according to the values that you think are the ones worth fighting for?
Yeah, no, I mean, everything aside, I'm kind of optimistic, despite all of the discussion and conversation that we've had, or at least not as pessimistic as our responses would probably lead people to believe. I mean, I think it's just that I think the responses and the things that will safeguard and salvage democracy it's not the design primarily, right? It's politics, and it's people's sense that democracy really works, right? As an effective system of government. I mean, that's the sense that I think has to get built. But you do see examples of, you get two episodes in the last year or so, right, or a little more than a year, like the Brazilian elections, right, and also the recent Polish elections, where you see, I think in some ways, some backlash to the backlash in a way, right, an attempt to kind of restore where democracy has its defenders, and these are powerful groups often that. All is not lost electorally, and I think that's where these battles we won are lost. And I do think, I don't know that the perception has been quite built to the extent that it needs to be, and I don't want to sound melodramatic or myopic in terms of what I'm looking at, but I think the 2024 election in the United States will be a critical kind of era-defining event, and yet a weird one in a lot of ways, right? Where that certainly will have a big bearing on the stakes of democracy in the U.S. and I think to some degree globally as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, David Landau, I want to thank you once again for speaking with me about what really is the most important paper of the last decade, Abusive Constitutionalism. What a nice conversation we've had, in which you've talked about the origins of the paper, about its migration, the ideas migrating around the world, and also your reflections about your home country, the United States, as well as what is next for you in your scholarship, you and your co-author, Roz Dixon at the University of New South Wales. Thank you so very much, David. Of course, I look forward to reading the work that you're currently writing, as I'm sure everyone else in the field does.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard. It's been an honor to be here, and really a fun conversation.
Thank you.